Okay then. I believe we are recording. We better be. Hello and welcome to question and answer number 151. I am your host, Punyo Basa. And 151 apparently is a prime number. So this should be a prime episode. Oh, almost took a drink without taking the umbrella out. This is my beverage, by the way. And I'm your host, Punyo Basa. I always forget. I don't notice, it's just like this automatic thing now that I say stuff at the beginning and then I don't remember if I just happened to mention I'm your host, Punyo Basa, and I just noticed it's like I got like this rune, like this like Scandinavian rune bead on my beard because I've taken another step towards becoming a Viking marauder. And I think the rune is just some like completely mundane one, like thorn. But it causes my beard to wiggle when I talk, just because of the metalness of it. So it's going to be distracting me, I suppose. Hope it doesn't distract you too much. It's like you get to the end of the Q&A and it's like, I forgot to pay attention to what he's saying because I'm just like watching his beard bead like bob around. Anyways, let's see. 151 is a prime number. I already mentioned that. And I'm getting started late again today. It's like 3 in the afternoon on Saturday, going, or is it Sunday? Yeah, I guess it's Sunday, isn't it? And I've got work to do. Yesterday was going to be my day of rest, and then we wound up going to a hardware store and buying like 700 pounds of concrete and 300 and something pounds of sand. And I'm like pushing this cart with well over 1,000 pounds of stuff on it, like literally from one end of this huge hardware place to the other side. So I didn't get as much rest as I really was liking to get yesterday, because Saturday is like my day of rest. It's like my lazy day. Today, after this, I'm going to be out moving bags of concrete and also doing the finishing touches, I hope, on the fish pond I've been working on for a few weeks. And then tomorrow, it's going to be like putting down some like cement, like shaping, like filling in rock holes and stuff in the sides before we put in the liner. Put water in the pond. And at some point I'll probably do a Q&A with the pond in the background just so you guys can gaze in awe and wonder at our new fish pond. But I suppose I should just start answering questions because, that's the main reason why we're here, isn't it? So, first question is from Maitreya Buddha. And Maitreya Buddha says, was there a relationship between the Zoroastrians and early Vedic settlers in India? The Hindus call good deities devas and bad deities asuras. However, in Zoroastrianism, the good god is Ahura Mazda and the devas were the destructive deities. Yeah, I've noticed that too. And I used to think that at some point the Persians broke away from like the mainstream of Indo-European religion because, it's the Greeks have the same legend. So it goes way back, where you've got this war between two sets of gods, two pantheons. The Devas win, the Asuras or the Titans, going with the Greek term, lose, and then they get like chained up at the base of a mountain, which would be Mount Meru for the Indians. But the Persians had it switched around so that their good god was an Asura, and the bad gods were the Devas. So it's like they switched around so that the other side won. And I used to think that this was probably, it was sort of like a war of pantheons between, two sub-tribes of the Proto-Indo-Europeans. But it could be, I've been thinking about it later, it could be that just the founder of Zoroastrianism, Zarathustra, that he may have just deliberately switched things around just to like accentuate the difference of his religious system where he's saying, no, you guys have got it all wrong. The Devas were the bad guys and they lost. That kind of thing. So that's possible too. And I haven't really studied into like the archaeology of it or anything like that enough to really decide exactly why it is that the Persians like flip-flopped this like ancient prehistoric theological war so that the losers became the winners and the winners became the losers. Because apparently most Indo-Europeans believed that the gods defeated the Titans. You know, the Devas defeated the Asuras or Ashuras. So let's just get to the question, though. The actual question is, was there a relationship between Zoroastrians and early Vedic settlers in India? Well, like the Persian sub-branch of the Indo-Iranian language family, which is a branch of, Indo-Europeans. So the Persian branch of the Indo-Iranians and the Indian branch of the Indo-Iranians, the Indo-Aryans, apparently had already split. Like Zoroaster or Zarathustra apparently lived back in like early Rig Vedic times, or even a little earlier than early Rig Vedic times. And so, I mean, he was just kind of doing his own thing. He was over like dealing with the Persian branch. The Indo-Aryans were already a separate culture by that time. And maybe in the Rig Veda, you'll find references to, like the neighboring Persians' different religious system. But I haven't read enough of the Rig Veda to really be able to find it. Of course, I don't read Vedic Sanskrit either. So I'd be relying upon translations that may be more or less competent. But by the time of the Buddhist time, it's the center of Vedic culture had moved eastwards, farther east along the Ganges Valley. And I don't remember seeing any mention at all of Persians or Zoroastrians in the Pali texts. They were far enough away, and the Indian culture was insular, provincial enough that there wasn't really an issue. There wasn't seen to be any need for religious polemics explaining why the Persians have a wrong religion. The Buddha was talking about Jains, Ajivikas, and like Vedic Brahmins. That was like the religious system in the Buddhist time, like in the central to eastern Ganges Valley of northern India. So I notice I say "so" a lot, sometimes for no other reason, just to like fill gaps. I think just about any language has these little particles, grammatical particles or whatever they're called, just to fill gaps. There's a lot of like basically things like that. Burma has lots of just special words just to throw into sentences to kind of slow up the sentence enough that your brain can keep up with it, that don't really mean very much of anything. So let's see here. Was there a relationship between Zoroastrians and early Vedic settlers in India? I'm unaware of any obvious relationship. I think they had already gone their separate ways by that point. So the Zoroastrians, I've read Zarathustra came from Bactra in Bactria, which is, you would think it would be like the BMOC, what is it? I can't remember what BMOC stands for. But that's the BMOC. I guess I should back up a little bit. So you had a group of Proto-Indo-Europeans who migrate eastwards from the homeland, like in the Pontic steppe. And they were known as the Sintashta culture. They were considered to be the people who invented the war chariot, which was a devastating new military technology at the time. And it may be that the Sintashta culture was the first people that called themselves Arya. There's no indication that like the Western Proto-Indo-Europeans, like the Germanics and the Celtics and the Italics and the Greeks, that they called themselves Arya. I guess there's some kind of theory that Ireland, that the Ire in Ireland is a corruption of Arya, but that is maybe just a hypothesis that can't really be proven one way or the other. So the Sintashta culture in Central Asia, they eventually migrated farther eastwards and produced the more widespread Andronovo culture. And then some of the Andronovo culture migrated southwards into like what is now Afghanistan and like eastern Iran. And the ones that kind of settled in Afghanistan mainly became the Indo-Aryans. And the ones that kind of moved farther west, settled farther west, like on the plains of eastern Iran, they became like the Proto-Persians, and they just kind of went their own ways. I'm pretty sure that the BMOC, the Bactria something complex, that was mainly the ancestors of the Vedic Indians, and also the leaders of the Mitanni. Apparently, there was one tribe of Indo-Aryans that migrated all the way to Syria and became like the ruling class of a country called the Mitanni, which became extinct around, I think it was even before the Bronze Age collapse. Maybe. They were wiped out by Hittites or Assyrians or something. So, yeah, I don't think that there was a clear relationship. I mean, right at the beginning, when they're like living on the like neighbors, I mean, there's like a border, they're sharing a border, then probably there was some kind of cultural relationship between Zoroastrians and early Vedic settlers before they made it into India, I guess. But I don't know what the evidence for that would be. But presumably it did happen to some degree, but it wasn't as important and major enough to create a controversy that continued, well into the Buddhist time, much farther east in northern India in the Ganges Valley. I have seen no evidence of that. There's a famous person, I can't remember his name now, who wrote a book that the Buddha himself was actually from Persia, and that there's all these veiled arguments against Zoroastrianism in the Pali text, but I've just never seen it. In fact, I can't even remember a clear mention of Persia in the Pali Suttas. There's a mention of there's a tribe called the Kambojas that they spoke an Iranian language. They were like warlike barbarians living in the northwest that would sometimes cause trouble to the Vedic Indians of the Ganges Valley and farther west, like in the Indus area. But that's about as much of a mention of Persia or Iranian people that I can remember ever coming across in the Pali text. Although, what was his name? Darius, the guy who tried to invade Greece, tried to conquer Greece, and was defeated at first the Battle of Salamis, and then the Battle of Plataea. But I mean, according to the inscriptions and the early historians and so forth, that there were Indians fighting in Darius or Darius's army. So it'd be like northwestern edge of India would have been incorporated into the Persian Empire. But still, you just do not see clear evidence of any kind of mutual influence. I mean, they shared certain things, like the Soma sacrifice of the early Brahmins was essentially the same as the Homa sacrifice of the early Persians. But that's about as far as I can answer on this one. I mean, with regard to the relationship between Zoroastrians and early Vedic settlers, I'm unaware of any clear evidence, even though presumably it did occur. And so I'm just going to go on to Maitreya Buddha's second question, which is kind of along similar lines. He says, there is an inscription in ancient Persia that writes in the DNA inscription. I don't know what DNA stands for here. I don't think it's deoxyribonucleic acid here. The DNA inscription at Naqsh Rustam. Darius states, I am Darius the great king, king of kings, king of countries containing all kinds of men, son of Hystaspes, an Achaemenid, a Persian, son of a Persian, an Aryan, having Aryan lineage. And then Maitreya Buddha continues here. The word Iran is said to be translated to land of the Aryans. So here's the question. Did the Aryan invasion come from ancient Persia? How did Aryans differ between ancient Persia and ancient India? And I've already kind of pretty much answered this question in my answer to the previous question. So the Aryan invasion, the Indo-Aryan invasion, came from essentially Afghanistan, Bactria, as it was known to the ancient Greeks. And by that time, I'm pretty sure the Aryans had already split into the Persian Aryans, and Iran is a corruption of Aryan. Also, the Alans that were enemies of Rome, they were sort of like Scythian type nomads that lived on the Pontic steppe, like the homeland of the Proto-Indo-Europeans. That Alan also is a corruption of Aryan. So they were sort of like the Sintashta or Andronovo culture kind of started migrating back into the ancient homeland and taking that over. So let's see here. Did the Aryan invasion come from ancient Persia? The Aryan invasion came from north of Persia, like what would be now like Uzbekistan or something. And then it split, and one split went into Persia and became the Persians and the Iranian speaking tribes, and another branch, according to my understanding of the situation, migrated into Bactria and pretty much took over. There was a relatively advanced civilization going on in Bactria at the time. So the Indo-Aryans kind of incorporated more of this Bactrian culture before continuing onwards and invading into India. Whereas the Persians, as far as I know, had minimal influence from this Bactrian or what is now Afghanistan, this relatively advanced culture, although there had to have been cultural influences and so forth. So the Aryan invasion, the Indo-Aryan invasion came from like what is now Afghanistan, or that is the prevailing theory at present. Whereas it was like the earlier Aryans split into like the Persian speaking, the Iranian speaking groups that settled in like especially eastern Iran at first, and then like conquered their way westwards. And then the Indo-Aryans, like the Proto-Indo-Aryans, kind of conquered Bactria, apparently, in some way, and then continued onwards into northwestern India. So how did Aryans differ between ancient Persian and ancient India? You just had like two subgroups, one group moving into Bactria and just taking over a relatively advanced culture there. And the Persians, they moved more westwards into Iran, and they conquered a different cultures there, which helped to kind of divide the two subgroups of the Indo-Iranians. At least according to my understanding, although you're going to have some people, especially devout Hindus, who are just saying that the Aryans arose in India and then they spread out from there, and they'll have completely different theories. But the prevailing theory that I think is most plausible is that the Proto-Indo-Europeans arose like north of the Black Sea and spread out from there, with the Proto-Aryans being the ones that migrated eastwards into Central Asia. And I'm not exactly sure where the Tokharians would branch off, maybe from the Andronovo culture maybe the Tokharians considered themselves to be Aryan also, but I'm not sure about that. And I guess I should just move on to the next question. This is from Siovak and Sipad Zidana. And Siovak and Sipad Zidana says, when an enlightened being talks about things in terms of their own cultural background, do they not know what they're saying isn't literally true, or are they engaged in a noble lie? Excuse me. I don't think that's necessarily, I think that could be a false dichotomy. I think that the actual answer may come in between these two. Like an enlightened being. I mean, here we're second guessing the mental states of enlightened being, the subjective experiences of fully enlightened beings here, which is a prevailing theme on these Q&As, these Q&A videos. So, I mean, an enlightened being will know that the highest truth cannot be put into words. That the name that can be named is not the eternal name. So, I mean, if they're not going to lie, then they just have to remain silent, or else they'd have to speak in conditionals, like if this is true, then that is true, that kind of stuff. And I mean, that's not going to work when you're speaking to ancient tribes people. So, I mean, there's conventional truth and there is ultimate truth. I mean, according to Buddhist philosophy, Samudhi Sacha, Paramata Sacha. Samudhi Sacha is conventional truth, which is what the people in general consider to be true. Ultimate truth is Paramata Sacha, which, I mean, aside from attempts by Abhidhamma scholars and so forth, you just cannot put into words. So they have to admit, I think a fully enlightened being would have to admit that in order to communicate and interact with people, you have to adopt what they consider to be true, their working paradigm, their worldview, and speak in those terms. And these enlightened beings have been born and raised into that culture. Before they became enlightened, they were assuming that it's all reality, presumably, unless, they had some philosophical views that it's all illusion or whatever. But still, I mean, when you're participating in a culture and you're speaking the language that the people speak, I mean, you're going to know that it isn't ultimately true, but I mean, it wouldn't necessarily be lying. It's like skillful means. It's you got to get the point across, and you're not trying to lie. You're just trying to communicate to these normies to some degree. I mean, not all of them, especially at first in the Buddhist career. He wasn't speaking to normies even at the beginning of his ministry, his sasana, his dispensation. He was talking to, veteran ascetic renunciants who were heavy hitters at first. But still, I mean, if you're going to say anything, you got to use Vihara Desana. Vihara Desana is just the language of the world. It's just how you communicate. If you're going to use words, you're going to have to use symbols that are not ultimately true. So, let's see, do they not know that what they're saying isn't literally true? Well, I mean, they'd have to know. If they're fully enlightened, they would have had to have experienced ultimate reality to some degree, you would think. So they know that the name that can be named is not the eternal name. But at the same time, I mean, if the only way you can speak is lying, then, I mean, what do you say to that? They're not trying to lie. I mean, lying can only occur within the context of Samudhi Sacha anyway. So, conventional truth, I mean, you're just dealing with conventional truth, and conventional truth is considered to be true enough that anytime you say anything, you're not a liar. I mean, if this is true, if Siovak and Sipad Zidana's, his dichotomy here is valid, then any enlightened being who says anything, pretty much, is going to be a liar. So, yeah, I think that you take into consideration that lying is at the level of Samudhi Sacha. So you can say 2 and 2 is 4, and not be a liar. But 2 and 2 is 7. If you know that the answer is 4, you're just trying to deceive somebody by saying that for whatever reason. That could be considered lying. That could be considered wrong speech. But there would be no right speech at all. I mean, unless you're just really clever at logic where you put everything into hypotheticals or conditionals or whatever, that kind of thing. But even then, that might not hold water either. So, yeah, I would say none of the above would be the answer to Siovaksha and Sipad Zidana's question of them being ignorant that what they're saying isn't true, or they're just flat out lying. Yeah, I would say neither of those. So I'm just going to move on to Siovaksha and Sipad Zidana's next question, kind of along similar lines. He says, in one of Plato's works, Socrates says that it is sometimes okay to lie. The example he gave is of a person you borrowed a knife from who goes crazy and is at risk of harming themselves or others, then wants the knife back. Socrates says you shouldn't give the knife back and should lie to them about not giving it or losing it because it would be bad for them to get the knife. What would be the Buddhist response to this? Well, I mean, you can just not give the knife back for the time being without lying. I mean, you wouldn't have to lie in that scenario. You just say, you're being kind of nutty right now. I'll promise I'll give the knife back after you settle down a bit. You could say that. I mean, you're not really stealing if you fully intend to give it back at some point. But withholding it while they're a danger to themselves and to others, I mean, you wouldn't necessarily have to lie about that. So, from the Buddhist point of view, like a Buddhist arahant just wouldn't lie. If you're reading stories about Buddhist arahants in the text or the commentarial literature, like in the Visuddhimagga or something, lots of examples of enlightened behavior in the Visuddhimagga too, that, they're not going to lie. That they'll remain silent while at the same time fully intending to give the knife back after this person, is no longer a danger to themselves or others. So, I mean, that would still be within Buddhist virtue, within Buddhist sila. It wouldn't be necessary to lie in that case. But, I mean, sometimes it may be the lesser of two evils to tell a lie. Like one of my favorite examples is there's a story, the fourth wise man. It's a famous English story. I've got it in an anthology on the bookcase back there, about the Persian wise men who go to, offer stuff to the baby Jesus. They see the Star of Bethlehem and they move from, their magi in Persia who go on this pilgrimage to offer gold, frankincense, and myrrh to the baby Jesus. And there's this fourth one who he tells the other three, I'll catch up with you guys. You guys just go ahead. I got to take care of some business. I'll catch up with you on the road, God willing. And then he's continually, through his virtue and generosity, getting held up. He comes, like while he's traveling, he comes across some very sick person lying by the side of the road. He nurses them back to health before he continues on his way. So he keeps getting late. He never catches up to the other wise men. And so at one point, he finally makes it to the Holy Land. And the king of Israel, or Judea, has, Herod, has made this edict. All baby boys are going to be killed. So this fourth wise man, who never really catches up to the other three, he's got these treasures he's going to offer. He's got like this giant ruby, this giant diamond, and this giant pearl he's going to offer to the baby Jesus. But he keeps by the time he gets there, he doesn't have any of it left. By the time he finally comes across Jesus. But anyways, he's staying in this woman's house. She's got a baby boy, and Herod's soldiers are going door to door, killing all the baby boys. And this woman is just terrified. She doesn't want her baby boy to die. So this fourth wise man stands at the door. The soldiers come pounding on the door, and he hands them like the giant pearl to like the commander and says, there's no baby boy, there's no babies here, and just kind of hands him this bribe of this treasure. And of course, the army officer's eyes get really big. He sees this huge pearl that he knows is worth a lot of money. And so he just says, okay, there's no babies here, but let's just continue. And so he saves the life of this baby by telling a lie. And probably the soldier doesn't really care if he's lying or not. He just sees the pearl, and that's good enough reason. But still, the fourth wise man does tell this lie, but it's to save a baby. And of course, the mother of the baby is just like weeping tears of joy and gratitude. It's obvious that this is the better of the two scenarios. He could just remain silent and let them butcher the baby of the woman who is providing him with food and shelter. Or he could tell one little lie, which is kind of a semi-lie, because the soldier really doesn't give a shit whether there's a baby in there so long as he gets this pearl. So in a case like that, like a hero, a tragic hero from a dharmic point of view, may sacrifice his own virtue for the sake of protecting others. And, that's sort of like, I came up with this idea, I'm sure others have come up with it also, that a soldier for a Buddhist country could be seen as a kind of tragic hero. He's sacrificing his own virtue for the sake of others. So, he's obviously doing wrong by killing and so forth from a Buddhist point of view, but at the same time, he's doing it for a kind of, a selfless reason, at least if he's living up to the ideal. So in some cases, it may be preferable to choose the lesser of two evils and just take a hit on your virtue for the sake of others, or it's just the lesser of two evils. But with regard to the noble lie, like Plato is talking about the noble lie, where the government may be justified in lying for the sake of, public morale and so forth. Let's say the army takes a blistering defeat, from some enemy, and then, the public announcements, like the newspapers would say, it's like, well, there was an orderly retreat. Our side suffered considerable losses, but there was an orderly retreat from the battlefield, and we'll do better next time. That kind of thing. It's sort of fudging on the truth. Not as bad as just declaring a glorious victory, which it did happen. Like in Roman history, that there were cases of I think it was the Emperor Alexander Severus, who didn't last very long, who went on some disastrous military campaign against the Persians, got his butt kicked. And then in Rome, they're saying it was a glorious victory, when there's like rumors getting through that it wasn't a glorious victory at all, but the Romans got their butt kicked on that occasion. So, that would not be a noble lie, but maybe if you could twist it a little bit, it's like orderly retreat from the battlefield, that kind of thing, that it wouldn't be too bad. Let's see. But from the Buddhist point of view, lying it is like a violation of a transgression of virtue. You're going to be making bad karma for doing it. So you should make sure that it is the lesser of two evils if you decide to do that. And the lesser of two evils doesn't mean you lie to the police officer or you get in trouble. It's just like, if you have like a virtuous reason, it's going to cause more suffering overall to tell the truth. Then some people might opt for telling some kind of white lie, like the fourth wise man in the story. But still, from the Buddhist point of view, there's no justification that's going to remove any bad karma from that choice. You still take responsibility for your karma. So I guess I'm just going to move on to Sivakshan Sipat Zina's third question here. He says, in Majjhima Nikaya Sutta 60, and I didn't look up, which I don't remember what the 60th Sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya is. The Buddha says being an annihilationist is better than being an eternalist, because if you are an annihilationist and you aim for that, then you will end up in Nibbana. While if you are an eternalist, you will be, quote, close to lust, close to bondage, close to delighting, close to holding, close to clinging, unquote. This seems contrary to most spiritual traditions, where most are somewhat eternalists while denouncing annihilationism as nihilistic. What are your thoughts on this? Yeah, I do consider this not to be the best argument. I mean, in a way, this argument for annihilationists and eternalists also applies to no self and self. You know, most religions believe there's like an eternal soul kind of a thing. Whereas in Buddhism, you go with no self. And it's a similar situation to this scenario in Majjhima Nikaya number 60, where it's like both are kind of erroneous because the truth cannot be expressed in words. You know, so long as you're relying on some philosophical concept, you don't have reality. You don't know reality yet. But believing no self is kind of the lesser of two evils. You know, it's less of a mistake than believing in an eternal soul, because believing in that eternal soul helps you to kind of cling to an idea of self. Whereas if you believe in no self, you know, it's in a way it's less of an error. It's setting yourself up for less of a mistake, at least potentially. Because then you cling to this eternal soul, which isn't going to be the way your idea is anyway. I mean, the reality of it is beyond words. So, I mean, it's kind of a lame argument. You can find lame arguments in the Pali texts. I would be a little bit skeptical that the Buddha really said this, just because it is kind of a lame argument. But, I mean, that's kind of the main point, though, is that if you are an eternalist, then you believe in this eternal self, and you're kind of like making provisions for that and clinging to that, whereas you're just more of a nihilist, like a philosophical nihilist, especially with regard to no self, and when you're dead kind of a thing. Then, I mean, it's still erroneous. It's still like an invalid assumption, because all assumptions applied to the absolute would be invalid. But in a way, you're less potential for just wallowing. You know, you can wallow in any kind of idea. You can become a fanatic for any kind of idea, especially even like skepticism. You can be a fanatical skeptic. But just going with nothing is, I mean, it's just setting yourself up for less potential errors than just fervently believing in eternalism and like an eternal soul and all that. That it's just it was seen as kind of skillful means, I guess, that you're just going to choose this one just because it's like the lesser of two evils. So I guess I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Mooners, and technically this could have been the first question that was asked, but I don't like starting my Q&As with a question that I really don't know anything about. I can answer the question because the question is, have you heard of, and I can just say, no, I never heard of that, and then just move on. But it's not really a good way to start the Q&A. So it got bumped down the list a little bit. This question from Mooners is, have you heard of Argumentation Ethics as developed and expounded by Hans Hermann Hoppe of the something institute? And I've pronounced it Mises before. It's some kind of like right-wing economic philosophy. And I've been told that that's not how you pronounce it. It's like Mises or something like that. The Mises Institute. Mises. I have no idea. I'm really not into economics. I mean, I have some basic general ideas about economics, but I'm certainly not the champion of any economic system. Because economics is just, it's like the science of money, and it just has never been particularly interesting to me. But anyways, Mooners, after asking me if I've heard of Argumentation Ethics, he gives this very long essay describing it. And it's too long for me to read the whole thing. But the last paragraph, he kind of summarizes. So it says, in short, Argumentation Ethics holds that any justification for government coercion, or really any act of one group of individuals forcing their will upon another group of individuals, regardless of whether the latter group have done anything to violate the dignity of other persons, must be evaluated not just in terms of outcomes or traditions, but in terms of whether the justification can be made without contradicting the basic norms that make argument and therefore ethical reasoning possible. Now just multiply that by about 10, and that's like the essay about argumentation ethics. And so have I heard of argumentation ethics? No, I haven't heard of it. But I mean, the argument, these ethics, I mean, it's, in a way, it's like a kind of idealistic philosophy for a kind of libertarianism, as far as I can understand. And libertarianism sounds good in theory, but I don't think it works in reality. I don't think it'd be like anarchy, pretty much. Anarchy doesn't, I mean, it sounds good. There's people on the internet just very authoritatively, like Stefan Molyneux would be one. I mean, he got kicked off of YouTube, I guess, long ago. But, you know, they're like libertarian, like philosophical anarchists or something who think that anarchy would actually work. You know, you got no real system of government other than just what is everyone agrees on, kind of. And yeah, I think it's just kind of like an idealistic philosophy that sounds good, but I don't think it would work in reality. You know, who's going to accept the assumptions of argumentation ethics? You're going to have an entire population accepting the assumptions of argumentation ethics? I really don't think so. So, I mean, I think politics and reality are a lot dirtier, and just there's a certain amount of unavoidable corruption that is just going to be there because we are human. So, yeah, I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Cherzaskaziz. And Cherzaskaziz says, what would happen if you became a monk again? Would you be junior monk and start your way to mahathera from the beginning, or would your new preceptor somehow add your previous 29 or 30 rains retreats to your new monkhood and make you a senior monk from the get-go? No, you start from scratch. So any monk who disrobes, who reordains, they got to start at zero again. And then they'll have to take dependence on a preceptor or on a teacher, and just it's as though you just started completely over from scratch. So yeah, I'd be a junior monk again if I ordain, which I'm not planning on doing, not in this lifetime. So I guess I'll just move on to Cherzaska's second question, which is Mr. Fake Tig still meowing to you? No, actually, I told him that the meowing just kind of makes him seem like a furry or something. So he stopped doing that. Although he generally leaves one comment to every one of my videos, just kind of reminding me that he still exists and that he still would like to be on the Discord server and so forth. So, I mean, the absence of meowing is actually a good thing. That the meowing was just kind of problematic. So he realizes that it was viewed as problematic, and so he has stopped meowing for the time being. So the next question is from Throat Warbler Mangrove, whose name is spelled like it should be pronounced Creole. And this is just kind of it's like a rhetorical question, I think. I don't know if he was really expecting this question to be answered, but I have come across this sort of thing recently, as you may expect once you hear the question. So I'm just going to read this, and it does end in a question mark. So technically, this is a question. It's in the Q&A section. Fair game. It says, wow, man, Trump, he is just following the Zionist masters. Simplistic? Yeah, it is that simple. Narrow? Zionists run your country! 2 exclamation points. What a shame. Iran poses no threat to the U.S., but it does to Zionists. Trump was the no new war and America first guy, more like the Zionists first, and only wars that favor Zionists. Trump just bent over to the Jewish overlords in front of you. And here's the actual question. Is that a real man? And yeah, I think Trump is a real man. Just if you assume that there are men, there's any real men at all, yeah, I would say that Trump is one of them. So let's just kind of review this a little bit. He is just following the Zionist masters. And this, there's at least one other European that I have come in contact with, and also a Canadian, at least one Canadian, who has been saying the same stuff, that he's Zion Don. He's just a subservient lackey to Netanyahu. So he's just following the Zionist masters. So when Trump commands Netanyahu to retract his bomber planes, then what do you say to that? Well, that's just an exception to this golden rule here. Yeah, and he says simplistic. Yeah, just no, really no. And then he says, narrow, Zionists run your country. And to some degree, I mean, Zionists are very influential. I mean, I think he's referring mainly to the Jews, at least, the pro-Israel ones, the ones that take seriously their own scriptures saying that, Judea is the Holy Land and all that. So, yeah, I mean, there is a lot of influence of Zionists in America. There's much more influence of atheistic Hebrews, in other countries in Western civilization, like the EU, any Marxist country, they're run by essentially, atheistic Hebrewism. The more left wing a country is, the more they're just subservient to the atheistic, non-God-fearing Jews. Essentially, I mean, Marxism and Christianity could both be called plausibly, schismatic sects of Judaism. So let's see, Zionists run your country. What a shame. Yeah, Iran poses no threat to the U.S., although, of course, Iran, I mean, the new iteration of the Islamist Iran arose with the hostage crisis. It's like they immediately took 52 American hostages at the U.S. embassy in Tehran and kept them for a long time, using them as a kind of bargaining chip or just sort of a part of a power play, that kind of thing. Iran has just threatened death to America so many times. They've funded terrorist organizations throughout the world, including the Houthis, that were attacking American ships in the Red Sea, attacking pretty much all ships in the Red Sea. So, I mean, to say that Iran poses no threat to the U.S., I mean, they may not pose a threat to actually nuking New York or something, but obviously they are a threat to U.S. economic interests. See, but it does to Zionists. Yeah, also, Iran also calls Israel the little Satan and America the big Satan, and it threatens death to both. So Trump was the no new war and America first guy. Well, yeah, it's not really a war. I mean, Trump has done this kind of stuff before. He's taken out Soleimani. I think he was an Iranian, wasn't he? That was in his first term. And so, I mean, Trump, more so than Reagan, is just doing these surgical strikes, just bombing stuff. And I mean, it's not exactly a war. I mean, it's military actions against countries, which he's been doing before. And if you're going to be a Chad superpower, there's going to have to be some militarism. You're going to have to show the world that America is willing to kick some ass and that America is good at it. And taking the trannies out of the army is probably a good step in that direction. And occasionally bombing somebody, not like Obama, I've read just recently or heard recently that during Obama's administration, he was dropping on average over the course of his 2 terms 3 bombs per hour over the course of his entire presidency. I don't know if that's exactly true or not, but I have come across that figure. So, yeah, America first. Trump is still America first, even though he cooperates with Israel. But to say that he's just a subservient lackey, I mean, he is always saying and doing things that has Netanyahu just like gritting his teeth. That, I mean, let's face it, Trump is stronger than Netanyahu, and both of them know it. Apparently, some Europeans don't know that. Some people that are just black-pilled because Trump isn't right-wing enough or whatever. But the fact is that, I mean, he sees what American interests include, but also there's also this other aspect. In addition to that Israel is like a strategically important ally in that part of the world. Okay, there's that. And so that to some degree, American interests and Israeli interests are going to coincide, even if normies who write comments on the internet are, I mean, they're not as aware of the situation as Trump is. He's got way the fuck better intel than guys that are just typing stuff on the internet from their bedroom or whatever. But also there's this other aspect to this whole thing. And that is, as I never tire of reminding people that for well over 1,000 years, Western civilization as a whole has worshipped a deified Hebrew. That we consider the Jewish God to be the one true God. You know, we worship, or at least Western civilization in general, we worship a Jew. We consider their scriptures to be our scriptures. We've added to them with the New Testament, but still the Old Testament is the Word of God and has been considered that by Western civilization as a whole for well over 1,000 freaking years. So what the hell do you expect? That you're going to have Western countries that are maybe more spiritual, more religious anyway, than like the atheistic EU at this point, that are going to be believing that Israel is the Holy Land. Their scriptures say it. Our scriptures say it. So, I mean, it's kind of different from like the Crusades. I mean, the Crusades is they were fighting to liberate the Holy Land. They were liberating it for Christians. You know, they were massacring lots of Jews, you know, as kind of incidental to the Crusades. You know, it's like when the first crusade, you had this rabble of like semi-armed peasants that were, you know, Dias Volt, and they're like migrating westwards. And most of the ones that made it into Asia never came back. But they're sort of like making raids on like Jewish villages in Europe just to live off the land and, you know, get their food and stuff and kill off Christ killing Jews supposedly on the way. So it's like the Crusades, they acknowledged that Judea was the Holy Land. It's just that they didn't like Jews. But Jews have definitely like risen in prominence and a certain amount of acceptance by Western civilization at this point. So now it's sort of transformed. Protecting the Holy Land is also protecting the nation of Israel. And it's like devout American Christians, what the hell are they supposed to believe? You've got Christians nowadays that are like anti-Israel, anti-Jews and so forth, but I mean, that requires either ignoring or just radically redefining certain basic tenets of Christianity, which includes the Old Testament. And the idea that the Jews were God's chosen people and that their land is the Holy Land and that God chose his only begotten son to be a Jew. I mean, what the hell do you expect? So that aspect, plus the idea that Trump really is not just some subservient lackey to Netanyahu, that he does things, and he like commanded Netanyahu essentially to pull back his planes and stop bombing Iran because he wanted to put an end to this. You know, Trump does want to be a peacemaker. He's willing to drop bombs or make some drone strikes in order to make sure that terrorists don't terrorize like he did in his first term. So, yeah, I really do think that this is just a narrow-minded, simplistic bashing of Trump by un-American people because they're not Americans. But you have to bear in mind that America is, it's much more Christian than Europe or probably Canada at this point. That Canada and Europe have much more preferred the atheistic Judaism over the theistic Judaism. But it's still there. So let's see here. I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Xenothoid. And Xenothoid says, thoughts on Rasputin? Well, I mean, my knowledge of Rasputin is relatively limited. About half of what I know about Rasputin I got from the movie Hellboy. So that's something to bear in mind. But Rasputin, I mean, there's you know, he was like the charismatic, like, he was considered to be a starets in the Russian Orthodox Church. They have like this concept of the guru, like Father Zosima in Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov is a starets. You know, he's like a Christian guru. And Rasputin, I'm pretty sure, referred to himself as a starets. And he also apparently was involved in some kind of shady, schismatic Christian stuff where they would indulge in like orgies, going with the idea that, you know, God's forgiveness is more glorious when he's got more to forgive, that kind of thing. He had like a hypnotic effect on the son of the Tsar who had hemophilia, and he could, to some degree, like comfort the child when he's suffering from the internal bleeding and all this because of all the inbreeding of European royalty. And so like especially the wife of the Tsar became like very emotionally dependent on Rasputin. He had a lot of influence. But with regard to some of the darker aspects, or the more esoteric, I should say, aspects of his religion, I really don't know that much. I suggest that you watch the movie Hellboy. But I mean, he was interesting. I mean, the very fact that it was so hard to kill the guy, I mean, that's kind of respectable in Rasputin. I mean, he was like shot and poisoned and drowned and stabbed and all this kind of stuff. Just finally they were able to kill him. But I mean, he may have had some kind of like psychic powers, or just had influence over spirits or something that gave him kind of paranormal, you know, some kind of paranormal effects that he was able, that were either centered around him, or he maybe was even actually able to like control to some degree. But I'm no authority on Rasputin. So I'm just going to move on to Xenothoid's next question, which is, are there any other dark mystics you think are interesting? And with regard to dark mystics in the West, I mean, I really was never interested in like Wicca or like Satanism or anything like that, which is where most of the dark mysticism, like the witchcraft kind of stuff. Aleister Crowley, he would be a dark mystic, I assume, but I don't think I've ever read a book by Crowley. I really don't know that much about him, other than just like sensationalistic documentaries I've seen like on YouTube, that kind of thing, or on TV back before YouTube. Lately, I think possibly you could even consider Styx Hexenhammer 666 to be some kind of dark mystic, although what actual power he has is questionable. But the dark mystics that have the most interest to me would be like some of those Tibetan Buddhist saints, Padmasambhava. If you've ever read the biography or the autobiography, I don't remember which it is, of Padmasambhava, he was doing a lot of dark mystic stuff, and he was an adept, let's say. He was very advanced, much more advanced than Styx Hexenhammer, or probably Rasputin. Another one would be Milarepa, who started off as a kind of dark mystic. He was like a dark wizard, black magic kind of wizard at first. And then he converted, he sort of saw the light and converted over to Tibetan Dharma and became a saint. But the dark mystics that I think are interesting would be sort of like the Vajrayana tantric ones. They would be some of the adepts, some of the more advanced, cultivated dark mystics. And with regard to Western dark mysticism, like quasi-Christian dark mysticism, I really don't know all that much. And I've always had sort of either just a complete lack of interest or even a mild aversion for Western attempts at that kind of thing, like witchcraft, Wicca, Crowley, that kind of stuff. I really have not been all that interested. And now that Styx Hexenhammer seems to be going off the dark end a little bit and turning into a lolcow with his leather pirate hat and so forth, I've lost a certain amount of interest in him also. So I guess I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from RFS. And RFS says, is there a highest being in the formless realm? And there isn't any kind of hierarchy there other than just the different levels of the formless realm. So the highest heaven of the formless realm would be the realm of neither perception nor non-perception, which is almost not, it's just extremely subtle form of samsaric existence. The most subtle possible form of samsaric existence supposedly would be being a deva or a Brahma in the realm of neither perception nor non-perception. And based on the name of that heaven, then that's a pretty good indication that there's not a whole lot of social interaction there. You don't have a king, you don't have like any kind of structured hierarchy or anything within that realm. That the beings there have no sense organs. They can't even really interact unless maybe they've got some kind of really subtle empathy or telepathy, but they're not even thinking in words. I mean, it's just this like billions of years long bliss of being in this state of neither perception nor non-perception. It's a state of perception so subtle that you can't really tell whether it's really perception or not. That would be one way of describing it, even though it's kind of self-contradictory. But I mean, neither perception nor non-perception is itself kind of self-contradictory. It's like it violates the Aristotelian laws of thought. A has to be either B or not B. And when you're ruling out B and not B, perception and non-perception, then you're already in a kind of paradoxical state. So much so that you had like the hardcore rationalist Jnanavira. He was an eccentric English Theravada Buddhist monk who lived in Sri Lanka in the 50s and first half of the 60s. He started off as an existentialist, was converted to Buddhism by reading Evola, Evola's book on Buddhism. And his disciples just would not translate that realm because he was such a rationalist. He could not deal with the obvious logical contradiction of the realm of neither perception nor non-perception. So he'd just leave it in Pali. But so there really isn't a highest being. I mean, you could say the highest being would be like the senior most inhabitant of that realm. Just, sort of like the senior most monk is the monk who's been a monk the longest, regardless of anything else. And you could say that if there is a highest being in the formless realm, he'd have to be in the highest formless realm of neither perception or non-perception, and just be like the senior one there because they're not really interacting. There's no real social structure or anything in these realms because they don't even have, because they have no body, they have no physical matter composing them in any way. They don't have sense organs. So maybe, again, there could be some kind of empathy, but I mean, it'd just be they'd be experiencing all pretty much the same thing, because they'd all be experiencing this realm of neither perception nor non-perception, which isn't much of an experience. It's the most subtle possible experience. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. Who has a Polish name, apparently, or a Slavic one anyway, that I cannot pronounce correctly, so I'm just going to call him Naziwial. And Naziwial says, I've once asked you for advice for a guy straight out of high school. Here's a couple of things about me. And this does end in a question, so no worries there. He says, I want to pursue a career in filmmaking. This revelation occurred to me 1 year ago, but since I don't have any success yet in the field, portfolio is required for film school, I am going to study psychology in the best university in the country for the time being. And then he says, I was learning in high school physics and mathematics on extended level, also taught myself B2 German, whatever B2 means. It's probably not the bomber plane. Gotta say, I crashed the finals, and it may be that Naziwial has not fully mastered the English language. I assume it's I crushed the finals, which meant he did really good on them, instead of just taking the finals uninvited or crashing in some other way. But Naziwial continues here, I don't plan on renouncing the world yet, since my reasons would be immature as I am now. This Hindu idea of 4 stages of life seems better to me. How come, this is the actual question here, how come I think about the escape when I don't even know the danger and satisfaction? Well, that's just like a deep intuition. Like when I was 17, started reading Eastern philosophy, then just at a deep intuitive level, I'm just going, yeah, I can accept this, even though I didn't fully understand it, and at the time was not ready to renounce ice cream and rock and roll and pretty girls and so on and so forth. So, I mean, just backing up a little bit, going up the scroll here, Naziwial wants to pursue a career in filmmaking. I think you would have to take into serious consideration the fact that AI is going to be taking over a lot of this stuff. That filmmaking in future, I mean, I don't know what kind of films you're making, but something like a documentary, I mean, it'll get to the point where you just type in to the AI what kind of documentary you want, and it'll just crank it out with almost no human effort involved in the making of the film. Maybe fiction, like a movie, it could be different. But even then, I mean, AI is going to get so advanced that very soon you may not have actual human actors in films anymore. There could start being John Wayne movies again, because the AI will just start, inserting John Wayne into these AI generated movies. So I'd be very careful. Just try to take into consideration, what you want to do compared with what AI is going to be doing, if not already, then soon. So let's see, high school physics and mathematics at extended level, that's good, although AI is going to be taking over a lot of that kind of stuff too. And let's see, and so you get to the last part here where the actual question is, how come I think about the escape when I don't even know the danger and satisfaction? Probably at a deep intuitive level, based on parami, just sort of the wisdom that you have accumulated over previous lives, that even though your brain in this version of samsara hasn't fully caught up with that wisdom yet, that still it's there. The Hindu idea of the 4 stages of life, yeah, I mean, it's more conducive, more compatible with a kind of social existence where, you get married and you have your kids and all that before you renounce the world. But the problem with that is the longer you wait to renounce the world, it's like every day you postpone renouncing the world is 2 days lost, because you've got 1 day left of your lifetime, and also you've got 1 extra day of accumulated habits that you have to somehow overcome. So there's a saying in Burmese, do tuet apio ket, which means a monk who is ordained later in life is difficult to teach, because the older you get, the more set in your ways you are. So that if you renounce the world when you're young, you're more flexible, you're more likely to be able to make significant progress, whereas the older you get, the more set in your ways you are, and just the harder it is to like deprogram a lot of your habits. So let's see. Yeah, just bear in mind the AI issue. And I'm just going to move on to Nazaiwial's second question, which is, do you think there's room for Buddhism in modern Western academia? And this is serious. He's not joking here. And he continues, from my point of view, the West is pretty close to anatta. Postmodernism is famous for its critique of essentialism. Also, Michel Foucault and death of the subject. But at the same time, it does not arrive at Buddhist conclusions about compassion, serenity, and discipline. This one mostly, discipline. Do you think that there is a possibility of reconciliation? Perhaps Buddhist view could purify contemporary Western BS. Well, the first question mark is up at the top here. Do you think there's room for Buddhism in modern Western academia? And there's plenty of Buddhism in modern Western academia. And most of the Buddhism I've encountered, possibly just because of like algorithms or something, it's like progressive, like quasi-Buddhism. You've got like queer Buddhism, non-binary Buddhism, lesbian Buddhism, this kind of stuff. You got like these queer, non-binary lesbians are in academia. Anne Gleig would be an example of this. So I think she's at some university in Florida. And they're just, I mean, it's like they're just interpreting Buddhism through a queer lens and just publishing these articles, academic articles, peer-reviewed articles about, you know, how Buddhism is queer friendly. You know, it doesn't condemn homosexuality the way other world religions do and so forth. And they just reinterpret Buddhism. I've mentioned before that like some Western academic Buddhists actually think that the second noble truth should be revised, because all suffering isn't because of clinging or attachment, craving. It's white patriarchal oppression causes suffering too. So they got to add that in. You know, it's like the second noble truth, the truth of the truth of the cause of suffering. You know, it's, you know, like craving and white patriarchal oppression. So what I have seen in Buddhism, I mean, you do have serious Buddhistic scholars, most of whom aren't Buddhists, who are coming up with these theories about, you know, the origins of Buddhism and so forth. And that can be interesting. A lot of the time, because they're not Buddhists, they don't fully understand the philosophy. You know, they haven't really lived the life kind of thing. But, I mean, they do come up with interesting ideas and valid ideas. And so that kind of Buddhistic stuff is worthy of consideration, but it applies only to, you know, this school of Buddhism or that school of Buddhism and their origins and, you know, connections with other systems in that time and so forth. So it's not like injecting Dhamma or Dharma into just the Western academic worldview. I mean, there's a little bit of seepage, you know, a teensy bit of, you know, just kind of bleeding over into other disciplines or whatever. But most of the academic Buddhism, I mean, it's either like this obscure niche stuff that's very technical, or it's this progressive, you know, like pseudo-Buddhist bullshit. I mean, it does have some real Buddhism in it, but they've obviously got an agenda, which is like cultural Marxism. And they're using Buddhism as like a vehicle for that. So there is room for Buddhism in modern Western academia, but modern Western academia is just like this leftist shit show at present. And it's just going to be taking Buddhist ideas and inserting it, using Buddhist ideas to support this cultural Marxist stuff as a general rule. There's lots and lots of that. So there's going to have to be a major shift in the whole attitude of academia, which may be starting now because cultural Marxism is to some degree just falling. It's just going out of style. So many people are rejecting it as just cringe bullshit now that to some degree, some of the major universities are kind of backpedaling, kind of like pulling back from that kind of stuff, especially now that you've got the Trump administration like outlawing a lot of it. So like DEI hires and so forth. I mean, that's one of the problems. You got DEI hires in academia writing this Buddhist stuff, and they shouldn't even really be there, just because they're only there because of a quota, not because of them being like the most qualified person to get the position. So do I think there's a possibility of reconciliation between Western academia and Buddhism? Yeah, but it's going to require, like I just was saying, there's like the prevailing attitudes of Western academia are going to have to change. You know, they're going to have to stop blaming Whitey for everything bad, for example, and before you can accept that desire is the cause of all suffering, you got to get rid of all this Marxist bullshit. You know, it's just this spiritually bankrupt materialism where it's just like your socioeconomic position in society is determining whether you're happy or not. But I mean, it's theoretically possible, especially if there's like some sort of like, I don't know, like some kind of right-wing renaissance, you know, anti-Marxist renaissance in academia, then possibly. But I'm not holding my breath, and I'm just going to move on to the next question, also from Nazaiwial, which is as follows. What do you think about existentialist philosophy? Sartre's nausea led me directly to Buddhism, for which I am grateful. Well, existentialist philosophy, if you're interested in existentialist philosophy and Buddhism, you should definitely read like the letters of Ñāṇavīra. I mentioned Ñāṇavīra already. He's like the eccentric English monk who lived in Ceylon, as it was called back then, in the 50s and 60s. And he started off as an existentialist. So he's talking about not so much about Sartre. He didn't take Sartre very seriously. He was mainly into Kierkegaard, who was like a proto-existentialist. He liked Camus. He kind of, who was that guy? He came up with the idea of the axial age. Carl, I can't remember now. But he kind of he kind of washed his hands of him. Gosh, I can't remember his name now. He was an existentialist. Karl Jaspers. He was kind of existentialist, but then he moved to mysticism, and Ñāṇavīra just hated mysticism. So he says existentialist philosophers, I mean, they kind of have a dilemma. They're either going to just wallow in a kind of nihilism, which is depressing, and they'll often become suicidal, or they just veer off into mysticism, which Ñāṇavīra just absolutely hated because it didn't really fit in with Aristotelian rationalistic laws of thought and all that. So what Ñāṇavīra was doing, he was trying to come up with like existentialism plus, you know, like the pro version of existentialism, which incorporates Dhamma so that you don't wind up with this nihilism and despair, and you don't veer off into mysticism, which Ñāṇavīra just could not accept at all. And so he came up with this hyper intellectual ideas of how to turn existentialism into like right view, where you don't hit this dead end of nihilistic despair. But I don't think that Ñāṇavīra was correct in his interpretation of Dhamma, even though he considered himself to be a Sotapanna and announced it to the world. And he supposedly became a Sotapanna while walking back and forth, just philosophizing majorly. So he just sort of thought his way into Aryahood, according to him. So what do I think about existentialist philosophy? I haven't read a whole lot of it. I tried reading some Sartre, but his philosophical essays are almost unreadable. It's like Sartre in his philosophical essays at least, apparently had this strategy of making sentences, composing sentences so long and convoluted that nobody, including him, could see the flaws in his reasoning. His biography of Tintoretto is well worth reading, though. I like that. And I mean, he wrote some fiction too, which was pretty good. You know, it's kind of like Camus, a lot of absurdity in the fiction. I've never read any Kierkegaard, although Kierkegaard, just based on what Gnanavira was saying about him, was intriguing. That he might be one of the best existentialists for a Buddhist or a spiritually oriented person to carefully consider, especially if you're not going to go the Karl Jaspers route and just veer off into mysticism, which is what I would do personally. So, I mean, existentialism, for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, is just that there is no inherent meaning in existence. And so you have to create your own meaning or just wallow in nihilistic despair. So, yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting. It's like a 20th century phenomenon. Kind of like Nietzsche's Death of God was sort of like a leading up to it. And, yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Some of the fiction, like Camus, I read a considerable amount of Camus' fiction. It's worth reading. You just it can at least instill in you kind of a dissatisfaction with wallowing in samsara when you realize that there's really no foundation to it, and to meaning, to a worldview. It's just kind of a lot of arbitrariness involved in that. So, yeah, I mean, different strokes for different folks. I mean, existentialism is not my particular favorite branch of Western philosophy or school of Western philosophy, but it can be interesting. And if you're like Gnanavira or into Gnanavira, then you can apply that to Dhamma in extremely complicated ways. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Kundru. And Kundru says, what are your thoughts on the recent law in Texas requiring the 10 Commandments to be posted in every classroom? Well, I think that is kind of a deviation from the American ideal of separation of church and state. And the 10 Commandments, I mean, as general moral guidelines, there is some goodness in it, although obviously followers of the 10 Commandments still consider it okay to kill people sometimes. So, I mean, it's not the most advanced kind of moral code. And of course, there's that, thou shalt not, worship any god besides Jehovah. So, I mean, just having it on the wall isn't too bad. I mean, if they start being forcibly indoctrinated into Old Testament Christianity or something, then, yeah, I would see more of a problem there. But, yeah, I mean, it does seem that it is a reuniting of church and state to some degree, as it's not even a particularly enlightened religious attitude. But I'm not sitting in classrooms, so I really don't have any particular dog in that fight. I'm not in a Texas school at present. So let's see. I mean, there's worse things that could happen. It could be like the Quran or something. So anyways, Kunder's second question is, I was recently watching a video on no self, or anatta, and one person commented something along the lines of, if there isn't a self, then stop eating for 4 weeks and you will discover that there is a self that will die of starvation, unquote. How would you refute this claim to support the Buddhist idea that there is not a self? I mean, that's not even an argument. I mean, that's not an art. I mean, he's just starting off. He's begging the question. He's just starting off with the assumption that there is a self, and then saying, well, if you don't eat for four weeks, that self will starve. I mean, he could use all kinds of arguments like that. You look in a mirror, you're going to see a reflection of yourself, right? Yeah, or like, it reminds me of Dr. Johnson, who wrote like the first major English dictionary. He was a famous guy back in like the 1700s in England. And he heard about George Berkeley's immaterialist philosophy, saying that there is no such thing as physical matter. And so Dr. Johnson, maybe just being a smartass, but he wasn't very wise. You know, he's very sophisticated and worldly, but not particularly wise. He just said, I refute him thus, and kicked a rock, which of course doesn't refute anything. So this person saying, if there isn't a self, then stop eating for 4 weeks and you will discover there is a self that will die of starvation. I mean, why even bother to starve yourself? Why not just reach for a cup of coffee and see, oh, there's a self reaching for the cup of coffee? That would be a much easier way of coming to that realization if it were a valid realization, which it is not. So how would I refute this claim? Well, I mean, you could use a little bit of doctrinal sophistication, use the simile of the chariot, which is one of the basic arguments against self in the Pali text. You've got this chariot, right? And you take the chariot apart, you disassemble it, it's just a pile of all the parts. The exact same parts are still there, you just took them apart. Is that a chariot? Well, not anymore. Or let's say you put the chariot back together, you take off a wheel, you put a different wheel on it. Is that the same chariot? Well, you could say, as a manner of speaking, yeah, it's the same chariot, even though you can change out piece after piece, just gradually one piece at a time until all the pieces are different. And it still would be considered the same chariot, just like the human body. You know, you probably don't have any of the same like materials in your body that you had when you were a baby. Maybe just very few. But I mean, so it's like, is it the same body? It's only as a manner of speaking. It's like a convenient generalization. And as Bertrand Russell said before, it's like every word in the English language is a generalization except for this and that. So the self is a generalization. It's just a convenient term. Or another example would be just a fire, like a candle flame. Not the candle flame that's behind me, I see it right there. Not that candle flame. Where is it? Right there. Because that's a fake candle. But let's say just a candle flame, it's completely different from one moment to the next. And in Buddhist philosophy, your body, your mind also are just different from one moment to the next. It's just in a constant state of flux. So, I mean, it's not the same self from one moment to the next. Even if you refer to a self, you know, there is no underlying essence that is like an individual self. So just because there's this body that is just a convenient generalization, like the chariot or the candle flame, even though that would disintegrate, that doesn't mean that there is an ultimate reality to that body. It's just a convenient generalization. And this is just one of the arguments for no self. There's other arguments that I won't even bother to get into because this really isn't a video just discoursing on no self. I have written a lot about no self and probably done some videos about no self. So you may be able to find a more elaborate discussion elsewhere. But I mean, this claim that this person made is just really a bad argument. It's not even a valid argument, other than people who just start off assuming that there is a self. And then, I mean, it's just begging the question. And that's one thing that kind of bugs me, is that people use the term begging the question without really understanding what begging the question means. Begging the question as a kind of logical fallacy means you are assuming the truth of something that you're trying to be proving. You know, it's like you're arguing in favor of something, while at the very same time, the whole argument is based on the assumption that your assumption is true. That, you know, like you're arguing for the existence of Bigfoot. And it's like, well, if there was no Bigfoot, how could they have taken all those pictures of him? That kind of thing. It's you're just assuming that Bigfoot exists as a way of making this argument supporting the existence of Bigfoot. And it's the same kind of argument that this person has done. Begging the question is just, you know, in your argumentation, you're already assuming the truth of what it is that you're working towards. And I'm just moving on to the next question. This is from Romeo. Romeo says, since I've been exploring Buddhism, I've generally experienced less suffering from applying its tenets. However, there are fundamental aspects of Buddhism that I keep hitting a snag with. For example, that desire is the root cause of suffering. I get how lack of acceptance and longing for things to be different leads to suffering in theory, but I often don't grasp this when applying it in my day-to-day life. For example, I enjoy Dunkin' Donuts coffee and have a cup or two as part of my daily routine. Every now and then I skip a day or two and notice a subtle craving for it. I don't get how my daily enjoyment of coffee at Dunkin' is problematic. After all, I'm not addicted to it, I just enjoy it. Another more pressing example is my longing to change my current living situation. Presently, I live in a crappy part of the Bronx and work an incredibly stressful job at a psychiatric crisis center. While I realize that there are pros and cons to every situation in life and try to make the best of both, I have a daily longing and aspiration to eventually get out of Dodge and start over. It seems that accepting my current situation with equanimity and not making moves would be almost masochistic and counterintuitive. If I am correct, Buddhism sees a value in cultivating a joyous mental state, but how is one to cultivate joy without longing for and achieving pleasurable experiences to back it up? Please help tease this out for me. So this is kind of subtle, you might say. Let's see here. It's kind of a long question. Scrolling up and down here, trying to tease out a few things. Let's see. However, there are fundamental aspects of Buddhism that I keep hitting a snag with. For example, that desire is the root cause of suffering. Well, I mean, I really don't see how that is problematic. It seems fairly obvious to me. Like if I'm unhappy about something, I mean, it's a classic example. This is just a classic example. When I was in Burma, most places I lived in Burma had no electricity. I mean, like monasteries, forest monasteries, no electricity. But there was this one monastery where I stayed at. It was in a military, it was on the outskirts of a military town. So it was on kind of the same military grid as this military engineering school. So the military government, it does take measures to make sure that in military areas, at least, there's going to be some fairly kind of semi-reliable electricity. So when I moved there, the abbot was saying, and there's electricity here like 24/7. And I'd lived in Burma long enough to know that, that doesn't sound right. That just doesn't ring true. How can you have electricity all the time? So, and it turned out I was right. It's like the electricity was on most of the time, but it would kind of go off and on at random. And so there were times when, this was up in the hills, like the foothills of the Shan Plateau. And so the weather there was relatively temperate. It'd get down to about freezing in the wintertime. And in the wintertime, when you don't have heaters, most places in Burma, you just use like the regular temperature water. You don't heat it up or anything. But at that particular monastery, it was just way too cold. Taking cold baths is something I've never particularly liked. And so you'd set buckets of water out into the sun. Sometimes even that wasn't good enough, like in the wintertime. So you'd have like this electric stove that you would heat water. You'd heat up like a few gallons of water and pour that into the water that you'd been setting out in the sun for hours trying to warm it up. And then it's tolerable. And then so I've decided I'm going to take my bath. I go over to heat up the water, and right then is when the power goes out. And just immediately I would be experiencing like aggravation, irritation, annoyance, dukkha. And it was just so obvious why. I want the electricity to be working. It's not working. Therefore, I am experiencing this annoyance and the irritation and dukkha. It's just a classic example, very obvious. And as soon as the electricity comes back on again, it's just like, it's just the whole problem evaporates. So, you got to bear in mind that Buddhist ethics is extremely subtle. It's way more subtle than like any kind of monotheistic morality based on the will of God, that kind of thing, like Christianity, that kind of thing, Islam, that Buddhist ethics are just extremely finely tuned, extremely subtle. So that, I mean, you're experiencing dukkha pretty much nonstop. That it's like this dukkha, it's like the thorn in the heart that is just driving you from one moment to the next. It's just this restlessness, this restless dissatisfaction is just pushing us through samsara at all times. And so, I mean, how subtle are you going to get? Let's see. Where's the Dunkin' Donuts part? Okay. For example, I enjoy Dunkin' Donuts coffee, and I've heard that it's good. And have a cup or two as part of my daily routine. Every now and then I skip a day or two and notice a subtle craving for it. Well, that's a certain amount of dukkha. It's a subtle dukkha, isn't it? I don't get how my daily enjoyment of coffee at Dunkin' is problematic. Well, I mean, that's up to you. If you want to see it as a problem, then it's a problem. If you don't want to see it as a problem, it's not a problem. But if something becomes habit forming, then first of all, when you're acting out a habit, you're not being fully conscious. And when that habit is interfered with, just automatic knee-jerk, like reflex dukkha arises. So, after all, I'm not addicted to it, I just enjoy it. But you do have a certain subtle craving for it, which causes a certain subtle dukkha. I mean, that should be fairly obvious. I don't really see what the problem is there. Because, I mean, Buddhism, you want to become fully enlightened, you have to eliminate all of that, or at least transcend it. I mean, if it's still affecting you, affecting, you know, what you consider yourself to be, then it's going to be a subtle problem, even though it might be so subtle that, you know, you don't really want to see it as a problem, which is fine. It's up to you. So then his other example is his longing to change his current living situation. And I mean, with regard to, living in a crappy area, having an incredibly stressful job at a psychiatric crisis center. Yeah, I mean, you're making good karma by helping people. I assume you're helping people. But there's going to be some bad karma too. And I kind of have some of that with my new job. I've been working there for 6 months, but I guess it's still considered a new job. It's my newest job anyway, where it can be very hectic and stressful. There are times when I just do not like that job. And then sometimes, you know, usually it's like the first half of the day sucks and the second half of the day gets better because, you know, I'm getting shit done, finally finishing up. And then there's like this kind of release of all this aggravation. But sometimes I'm thinking I'd be better off not doing this job. Other times it's like, well, this is like the part of my spiritual practice is dealing with these situations that tend to aggravate me. And I'm going to have to learn to deal with it, you know, because if you don't learn to deal with it, you just still got these uncooked seeds and you're going to have to deal with it sooner or later in some future life, possibly. So let's see. Daily longing and aspiration to finally get out of Dodge and start over. Seems with accepting my current situation with economic. Yeah, I mean, I really don't see what the problem is here, other than maybe Romeo here just kind of doesn't want to get very subtle in the situation. He doesn't want to get as subtle as Buddhist ethics clearly goes. Because, I mean, Buddhist ethics, sometimes you'll see statements like even happiness is dukkha. And I mean, like the traditional lame explanation for that, there are a lot of lame explanations in the text, is that even happiness is dukkha because it's impermanent. You know, it's not going to last, and then you're going to be unhappy again. But I mean, you could just twist that around the other way and said even dukkha is happiness, even dukkha is sukha because the dukkha doesn't last. But the dukkha is a chronic condition, so I guess there is that. So, yeah, I mean, you're just going to have to make up your mind. Are you willing to use this incredibly stressful job as a kind of spiritual practice where you're going to have to learn to accept the stressfulness? Or if it's just, you know, it's just not going to work that way, or for whatever other reason, you just want to switch to a different job. I mean, you can do that too. Whatever's going to make you happier, I suppose. But still, I mean, let's see. If I'm correct, he says, Buddhism sees a value in cultivating a joyous mental state. Yeah, it depends on what kind of joyous mental state it is. That, I mean, just like being high on heroin or something, in a way that's kind of blissful, I suppose. Not that I've ever taken heroin, but that is not like really a good kind of bliss or a good kind of happiness. The best kind of happiness is like the bliss of meditation, or just having like a clear conscience, that kind of thing, or just the sort of neutral happiness of just kind of like an equanimity and just contentment. That would be considered a good kind of joyous mental state, rather than like ecstasy, which is gonna have to balance out with its opposite. You're better off with a kind of happiness that has no opposite. See, but how is one to cultivate joy without longing for and achieving pleasurable experiences to back it up? Well, I mean, ultimately, you have like the ascetic mental state of, you have this equanimous bliss regardless of pleasurable experiences. You have this equanimous bliss while just lying on a concrete floor with a piece of wood for a pillow, eating one meal a day, drenched in sweat, a little cloud of mosquitoes around it. I mean, if you can be happy like that, no money, no friends, no family, homeless, living like a bhikkhu in ancient India, then, I mean, if you could be happy in that situation, you can be happy in any situation, which is kind of like the Buddhist ideal. That's one of the reasons why Buddhism emphasizes a certain amount of asceticism. Because, I mean, if you can be happy with an empty stomach, drenched in sweat, no money, no home, all of this, then you can be happy under any circumstance. You do not require the pleasurable experiences. So, I mean, if you're going to be living in the world, you just have to accept that, I mean, the Four Noble Truths are still true. And just dukkha is just extremely subtle. What is called suffering in English, the usual translation of dukkha. I prefer the term unease. Ajahn Thanissaro prefers the word stress. But still, I mean, there's no one word, because at the one extreme, it's the most unbearable agony. And at the other extreme, it's just the most subtle, vague, like semi-dissatisfaction, which is almost always there in everybody. Like, I remember reading this book, The Tangled Wing, Biological Constraints on the Human Spirit, where, as a biologist, he's saying that it's like everyone has always got this, like, it's like subliminal anxiety. It's just everyone is, all conscious beings are motivated largely by this restless dissatisfaction, this subliminal anxiety that just makes us want to be doing something other than just sitting there. But, I mean, it seems like Romeo just has a limit to how subtle he wants to be in his interpretation, because I really don't see that there's anything problematic at all. I mean, if you're gonna drink Dunkin' Donuts coffee, maybe even have an apple fritter on the side, and I mean, you do it almost every day, so that on a day that you don't do it, there's like this feeling of, what is the word that he says? A subtle craving. Well, it's just the subtle dukkha, and that's just the way life works. Like, some people, you forget your cell phone. It's like, what the fuck am I gonna do? I forgot my cell phone. It's the more attachment you have for something, the more you're gonna suffer. You got subtle attachment for Dunkin' Donuts coffee, you're gonna have subtle suffering because of it. And if you don't see that as a problem, you're willing to accept a certain amount of suffering as an equitable trade for a certain amount of happiness or pleasure, then fine. It's your choice to make. And I suppose I should just move on to a less subtle question here. This is from Rui. And Rui says, what was, in your experience, the most intense inner visual field imagery that arose during meditation, if any or at all. And the most intense inner visual field imagery that arose during meditation, well, just set aside any kind of like psychedelic drugs, because that's where most of the intense inner visual field imagery has occurred to me, would be like through like LSD, ayahuasca, that kind of thing. Also, there was one time when I had pneumonia at about the age of about 19, and I was hallucinating, like in a kind of delirium from that. But I wasn't meditating, I guess. So with regard to actual meditation that is not like influenced by like chemicals, at least not like artificial outside chemicals, that the most intense inner visual field imagery, there was mostly that would happen when I was sleep deprived. Like if I'm doing intensive practice and getting by on the least sleep possible, then I would start dreaming even when I was awake. Like I've talked about when I was doing intensive practice at Pandita Rama, where I was starting to dream in the evening because I was trying to get by on as little sleep as possible. And there was one time, I'm like sitting in front of a fireplace, and there's a person standing with their back to the fireplace in front of me talking to me, and I'm just getting ready to respond, and then I realize, no, I'm sitting in a meditation hall in Pandita Rama in Rangoon. So it was all very clear. It was like it was really happening, at least to my sleepy mind. So there was that kind of intense inner visual field imagery. I was like, when I was at Alando Kathaba doing intensive practice, it was just these weird dream images that would just keep coming up. And sometimes it was just strange stuff. It's largely random, like dream spam. Like somebody riding a bicycle across the creek. Down below, you just have this image of somebody riding a bicycle. Suddenly the bicycle shoots out from underneath them and they go flying backwards. And then after that, maybe there's like this numeral 9 just appears in my field of vision. It's like dream images coming up. So there's that, but that would literally be the most intense inner visual field imagery that arose during my meditation. It was just dream images coming up at random, largely due to sleep deprivation through the intensive practice. I did experience the nimitta on at least one occasion, which was sort of like this duck egg kind of elongated oval, sort of a grayish, whitish, cloud-like thing that you're supposed to experience as a sign of neighborhood concentration, as it is called. But that's not mentioned in the suttas. But that would be maybe the most significant inner visual field imagery I experienced that wasn't just due to dream images coming up through sleep deprivation. I did experience that nimitta that time, even though, the suttas really don't put much emphasis on it. But like in the Pa-out method, you have to experience the nimitta before you can get into jhana. So I guess I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from PSA. And PSA says, are you minimally exceptional? And I'm not even sure what that means. Minimally exceptional? I suppose so in certain ways. But I'm not exactly sure what minimally exceptional means. Just kind of exceptional? Slightly exceptional? I don't know. It seems like a value judgment or just a matter of opinion. And I might not be the best person to give such an opinion because I'm just too close to the subject, which is me. But I guess in some ways, I don't know. And I will say that Terzaskaz's came up with a question responding to that question, which is, are you exceptionally minimalist? And I don't know if I'd be exceptionally minimalist. I am kind of minimalist, though. Whether I'm exceptional, I guess in certain ways, and I'm also minimalist in certain ways. For example, if I did not have a woman, I'd be sleeping on some mat on the floor. I wouldn't be having all kinds of decorations on the walls. I'd be living pretty much like a monk in a cell, at least some of the time. But when you have a woman, women they do like comfort. And my woman has like an artistic temperament. You know, she's very aesthetically oriented. She likes everything to be looking nice. You know, there has to be like a picturesque balance of stuff, you know, colors and textures and all this. That, I mean, it's fine. You know, I'm willing to let her do her thing in that regard. Every once in a while, I'll even add a little input. You know, I think we should get a certain kind of plant and put it there, that kind of thing. But yeah, I'm more of a minimalist than most people, I think, even though I'm kind of living in a non-minimalist environment at present, largely because I got a woman that I do like to keep in good humor. I like when she's happy. So, yeah, I guess so. And now I'm just going to go back to PSA, who asked another question here, which is kind of a strange one. What do you think of Lily Phillips and Bonnie Blue? One had intercourse with 100 men in one day, and the other one did it with 1,000 men in one day. Yeah, probably they didn't last very long to get 1,000 of men in one day. And then, anyways, PSA continues, are you sure we're not headed towards the 7-day free-for-all sword fight? Yeah, the 7-day free-for-all sword fight is like there's a Buddhist text, I think it's in the Digha Nikaya, talking about how human beings are devolving at present, and eventually we're going to get down to like a lifespan of 10 years with puberty at 5, and everyone's going to be like killing and eating each other and all this. So what do I think of Lily Phillips and Bonnie Blue? I've seen pictures of them. Neither one of them really struck me as attractive. And just the very fact that they had done what they had done kind of makes them even less attractive because they're sort of like a walking petri dish. So, I mean, the thing is, though, there have been women like this for a very long time. There have always been women like this. You know, you read like Aphrodite by Pierre Louis, this was written in like 1898, but it's extremely pornographic in the literal sense because it's writing about prostitutes. And he's writing about prostitutes in Alexandria, Egypt, during like the late Roman Republic, back when Cleopatra was 12 years old, approximately. Cleopatra the Seventh, the famous Cleopatra. And this kind of shit was going on big time. So, yeah, I don't think that it's really a sign that that civilization is in decline. I mean, there's way better signs than that. I mean, there have always been hoes, including rather extreme hoes like this. So, yeah, it does seem that we are not headed towards the 7-day free-for-all sword fight, and we're not even headed for like really dark age barbarism and savagery unless civilization collapses due to some cataclysm like, you know, World War III or an asteroid strike or something like that could trigger it. But until that happens, I don't think that really we're going to be devolving down to a 10-year lifespan and just universal violence, that kind of thing. So, but what do I think of Lily Phillips and Bonnie Blue? Neither one of them is my type at all. There's a slight aversion looking at their face when you see them on like X or something, you know, just something about them. Yeah, just knowing that they did what they did just makes them seem like just a walking STD. So anyways, I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Blitzman, also known as Whoa, 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 Whoa. So let's just call him Blitzman, because it's hard to get the number of woes out correctly without counting them internally and so forth. So Blitzman says, not sure if you've ever addressed, as I have only started reading or watching your work a month or two ago. I'm curious as to if the process into settling back into your life as a layman after years of being a monk, did you feel guilt or inadequate in partaking in the world? Were your senses overwhelmed since you weren't in the forests anymore? What does your meditation routine look like now with your job and being with a partner, living in the world, etc.? Okay, I guess I'll have to take it apart at a time. And then, did I feel guilt or inadequate in partaking in the world? Not really. When I was a junior monk, I remember my father asked me, what would you do if you were just drop out of the monkhood? And at the time, I was still a junior monk. I said I'd feel like a failure. But after being a monk for I was a monk for 30 years altogether, but it was after I'd been a monk for probably less than 20 years, let's just say 20 years, that I just stopped making progress. I just got as far as I could get with it under the circumstances. And so, eventually it's just common sense. If you've been trying something for years and it's not working anymore, try something else. So I really had gone beyond the feelings of guilt or inadequacy when I stopped being a monk. And I've taken to heart, especially, I was talking about this in the previous Q&A, that guilt after the fact is called kukucha. In Pali, it's always bad karma. To feel guilt or remorse about anything is always bad karma. Always. So I've taken that to heart. And so feeling guilt or remorse is almost alien to my nature. Let's see. Were my senses overwhelmed since I weren't in the force anymore? The closest I came to sensory overwhelm, really, was all of a sudden I was free. I was liberated so that I could just walk to a refrigerator in my own home, open it at any time of day, and just help myself to any food in there. For me, that was just like this weird miracle. Because being a monk for 30 years, you only eat what somebody gives to you. You can't just help yourself at a refrigerator, and you can only eat in the morning and so forth. I can go to the refrigerator in the afternoon and just pour myself a glass of orange juice or something, which is, it was just like forbidden for 30 years. But it wasn't really overwhelmed. And I have to admit, saying nobody gets the right amount of whelm. Everyone, they're either overwhelmed or they're underwhelmed. I just got the perfect amount of whelm on that one. Nobody says that. So let's see, what does your meditation routine look like now with your job and being with a partner? Like I've said before, I don't do formal sitting practice anymore. I do like spontaneous oming, sometimes at work even. And then there's just like the standard mindfulness of daily activities. Like, for example, when I went like this, you just feel like it's kind of hot. We're in South Carolina and it's summertime. And so it's hot and I've got like this little film of perspiration. And so I go like this and you just feel the coolness as you move your hands, and it increases the evaporation of sweat on the hands. You feel like the air and, the urge to do this, keep doing it, that kind of thing. So it's like, that would be like my meditation practice, such as it is just sort of, basic mindfulness of events and mental states, actions and mental states, including mental actions, and just spontaneous oming from time to time. Let's see. So, the general process into settling back into life as a layman, it was the most radical change for me is I'm sharing my life with another person now. It's not a whole lot of privacy. There's like this third entity, which is like the us entity. And so that took some getting used to. But it's fine. I'm certainly not complaining that I've got like this beautiful woman living with me. So let's see, where was I actually going with that? Yeah, just sort of, there was a little bit of, not so much overwhelm, but 30 years of programming of just being like this ascetic, following monastic discipline. And all of a sudden, I've got this woman sharing my bed and I can just eat whatever I want and all this kind of stuff. So that there was like this kind of like habitual or even mildly neurotic, this sort of inhibition that I had to like struggle through to some degree. And I think my 30 years as a monk really has kind of permanently changed certain aspects of my mind, how it works with regard to, I was always kind of tending towards austerity, that kind of thing. But, see. Curious as to if the process into settling back into life as a layman after years of being a monk. And it was actually pretty easy because, I mean, when you're a monk, I mean, it was pretty easy for me. It wasn't really that radical of a change because when you're a monk, you're supposed to like deal with any kind of stimuli as just stimuli. You know, it's just, you see a person in front of you talking to you, you sort of deconstruct that person into like visual perceptions, auditory perceptions, and so forth. And it's sort of like seeing the world on like a television screen in a way. You know, you just sort of deconstruct the meaning of everything until it's like stimuli. And so when I stopped being a monk and started being a layperson again, you know, it's just like a change of movie on the TV screen to some degree. There was some of that also. And so I made the transition fairly easily. I'd already been a layperson before, so it was, to some degree, it was just sort of like the reactivating of old layman's habits and so forth. But I mean, it really wasn't all that difficult. It wasn't really that big of a deal. Like it wasn't problematic other than the few little things that I've already mentioned. And so I guess I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Philalethes. And Philalethes says, have you read William James's Varieties of Religious Experience, and what do you make of it? Yeah, I've read it. I've got 2 copies of it on my computer, and I had another copy on my bookcase, which I looked for it just before starting this, and I didn't see it. So maybe I don't own that paper copy anymore, but the print was really small, especially the footnotes. But William James' Variety of Religious Experience, I have recommended it before. It is like a significant book for me in my reading history. You know, every once in a while you read a book that really makes an impression on you. William James' Varieties of Religious Experience is like that. That he's very intelligent, and he's got lots of interesting case histories of what it's like to be religious, different aspects of religion, including like asceticism. And I pretty much agree with a lot of what he says. And the main shortcoming, I guess, of William James's Varieties of Religious Experience is that it was composed like around 1902, you know, well over 100 years ago. And so most of his case histories, his stories that he's drawing from as examples, are Christian. Because Western civilization has been traditionally Christian for well over 1,000 years. And so, I mean, he includes a little bit of, what was it, Ramakrishna or Swami Vivekananda or something, just a teensy bit of Hinduism. I don't think there's any Buddhism at all. There might be just a slight reference to it or something. But it's mostly Christianity. But still, he's dealing with general aspects of the religious mind and religious experience. And so people are people, and the experiences might be interpreted somewhat differently, but there are similar experiences between a Christian and a Buddhist, for example. But it's well worth reading. I think anyone who takes religious experiences seriously would benefit from reading The Varieties of Religious Experience by William James. And so I'm just going to move on to Philalethes' next question, which is, once you mentioned the General Epistle of James essentially contains a discourse on the second noble truth. Could you re-explain this? Okay, well, as it turns out, I got my Bible right here. This is the best Bible I've ever owned. I think it's a Catholic one. It contains the Apocrypha, the Deuterocanonicals. And it's got like alternate readings. It's got all these footnotes. You know, like the story of the woman taken in adultery, and Jesus says that he is without the first sin, cast the first stone. You got this footnote saying that in some early manuscripts, that was actually in Luke instead of at John. In other manuscripts, it switched over to a different part of John. You know, it's apparently like a later edition, like where it's talking about Jesus's mother being a virgin, and it's supposedly quoting the Old Testament about the prophecy. And there's this footnote saying, in the original Hebrew of the book of Isaiah, it doesn't say virgin. It just says a young woman of marriageable age. The word in Hebrew, the original word in the Old Testament, just means a young woman. And then that got mistranslated into Greek as virgin. And then the New Testament authors were relying on the Greek translation more than the original Hebrew, and just assumed that this statement in Isaiah, there will a young woman will give birth to a son, and his name will be Emmanuel, which means God is with us, et cetera, that was somehow a prophecy of the Messiah, which it wasn't. And so there's like timelines in the back. There's maps. Let's see here. Maps. So it's a good Bible. Anyways, getting back to the actual question, though, let's see. I mentioned that the General Epistle of James contains a discourse on the second noble truth. Could you re-explain this? I may as well just read it. So it's the beginning of the General Epistle of James, chapter 4. And it says, "Where do all the fights and quarrels among you come from? They come from your desires for pleasure, which are constantly fighting within you. You want things, but you cannot have them, so you are ready to kill. You strongly desire things, but you cannot get them, so you quarrel and fight. You do not have what you want because you do not ask God for it, and when you do ask, you do not receive it because your motives are bad. You ask for things to use for your own pleasures," etc., etc. So, I mean, that's like right out of the Kalaha Viwada Sutta of the Atthakavagga. This is just very archaic Buddhism. You can find this sort of thing in the text. I mean, it's essentially the second noble truth. And the second epistle of James, I mean, James apparently was the successor of Jesus as the leader of the Christian church. He was like the leader of the Christians in Jerusalem. And then Paul just kind of became schismatic and was emphasizing the non-Jewish element of Christianity. But James apparently was like the successor of Jesus as leader of the early Christians. And he got kind of outcompeted by Paul, and he's almost absent from the Bible. He got edited out of the Bible, apparently, aside from this one epistle, and it's got more wisdom in it than possibly all of Paul's epistles combined. It's got a lot of really basic like moral advice, and a lot of what could be called dharma. So, anyways, I think I answered that question. So I'm just going to move on to the next one, which is from Siddhartha Lohachita. And Siddhartha Lohachita says, "Do you think the common man can experience glitches or failures in samsara, or the matrix, as people would say today? I've seen inexplicable videos like a vehicle appearing out of nowhere and crashing into another, defying all laws of physics. In general, these are unexplained phenomena. What do you think could be causing them?" Well, I read this book. I've talked about it so many times. Some of you are probably just sick of hearing about it, but it's The Trickster and the Paranormal by George P. Hansen. And his explanation of paranormal events resonates with me. I think there's a good chance that he is right. In a conventional sense, ultimately, nobody's right. But in the conventional sense, he's saying that, I mean, in a way, it kind of agrees with early Buddhism, like this universe is mind-made. And so there's going to be anomalies because our minds are not perfectly rational. If our minds were perfectly rational, we'd be robots. And we're not robots. There's a certain like inspiration. There's like a consciousness of life, a living consciousness in us that really can't have everything locked down and completely regular. And so there are like gaps and weak places between the rules. You got like the so-called laws of physics. Also, you've got like, I mean, just the laws of physics aren't enough for a human, you've got to have like social laws and taboos and all that. But still, there are like weak places, like joints between the rules, where sometimes like chaotic, impossible stuff can come in. And that's his explanation of how the paranormal works. That it's sort of like cracks between the rules where this stuff seeps in. And so according to him, you're never going to be able to standardize the paranormal. Like parapsychologists are never going to lock it down, explain exactly what it is, because there aren't any rules that like universally apply. It's just like stuff leaking in between the rules. So yeah, the common man generally, I think most people, I've read like in a parapsychology book that most people, if you ask most people, they will say that there has been some kind of inexplicable paranormal event has occurred in their life. So yeah, I think that's just, it's always with us, that there's never, that the rules that govern our version of samsara are never going to be so complete and universal that it's just going to lock everything down so that nothing can break the rules. And it probably happened more before science than now. Like the scientific worldview has like a more comprehensive and what's the word? Coherent set of rules, so that you're going to have less weird stuff leaking in than like in pre-modern times when people believed in magic and gods and that sort of thing, that left more gaps. So let's see. And of course, some like wizard and witch types deliberately make gaps by violating taboos, that kind of thing, that then allows the paranormal to leak in more easily. It's like this gimmick. So yeah, and then of course, like normal people that approach like very advanced saints are going to be exposed to even more of this. Or on the other, like the other extreme, they're exposed to like demon possessed psychopaths. There's going to be weirder stuff happening around them too. Just because they're breaking rules that is like causing a certain amount of chaos and more gaps between rules in a sense. Weakening the matrix in that way, deliberately producing glitches. So yeah, I'm not a materialist, so I'm not saying that, there really is this material world around us that is just slavishly obeying laws of physics, that kind of thing, that it's like the first verse of the Dhammapada, it is all mind-made. And we do the best we can, but we're not perfect, and so we do not create a perfect world. And all of a sudden I realize we're at the last question. My golly. And this last question is from Liberating Insights. And Liberating Insights says, could you talk a little bit about Buddhaghosa and how authentic his translations are? I understand he has biggest influence on the Theravada tradition. Yeah, Buddhaghosa is the main commentator to the Theravada tradition. In fact, Orthodox Theravada might be more correctly referred to as Buddhaghosism than Buddhism, because a lot of Orthodox Theravada doctrine comes from the commentarial tradition, especially like Abhidhamma commentary. But Buddhaghosa lived like in the 5th or 6th century of the Common Era in Sri Lanka. He was supposedly a Brahmin who came from India, and he was converted to Buddhism. And with regard to his translations, I mean, that could be a misunderstanding on the part of Liberating Insights. The only translations Buddhaghosa is known for would be translating like ancient Sri Lankan commentarial literature into Pali. So there was already like a commentarial tradition. There were already commentaries before the time of Buddhaghosa, but in Sri Lanka, there were like the Pali or whatever language originals had been lost, and all they had was Sinhalese translations. And so one of Buddhaghosa's jobs when he's like editing and compiling these this commentarial literature was he was translating it into Pali, from Sinhalese into Pali. So there's some of that. That was about the main translations that he did, was translating like pre-existing commentarial literature into Pali from Sinhalese. And I've never really had a high opinion of Buddhaghosism. I mean, when I became a Buddhist, I wanted to follow the teachings of Gautama Buddha and not Buddhaghosa. And like I've said, a lot of just basic Theravada Buddhist doctrines are more Buddhaghosism than Buddhism. So, yeah, Buddhaghosa is the author of many commentaries. In the commentarial, the Atagatas, including the central commentarial work, which is in Theravada Buddhism, the Visuddhimagga, the path of purification. So, some schools, especially Burmese Buddhism, like the Pa-Aut method, Buddhaghosa is just considered to be just infallible. In Burmese Buddhism in general, the commentarial literature of Buddhaghosa and others are just, it has to be right. You can't question it. This, not only are the suttas correct, but the commentaries are correct. And in fact, the commentaries are in some ways more authoritative than the suttas themselves. Because if the Buddha says red and the commentary says, when the Buddha said red, what he really meant was blue, without the commentaries, you wouldn't know that it's really blue and not red, so to speak. And so I used to just really bash away at Buddhaghosism, as I called it. But that was when I was in Burma, because that's where everyone's taking it seriously. I come back to America and like scriptural dogmatism and just believing the commentaries as just the infallible word of Buddha, when it's really the fallible word of Buddhaghosa and others. It just wasn't as much of an issue in the West. In the West, there's these other issues like scientism sort of supplanting Dhamma as the main explanation for reality. So when I was in Burma, I bashed away at like Buddhaghosism and just kind of Abhidhamma, which is largely Buddhaghosism, because some of the most basic teachings of Abhidhamma, so-called, isn't even found in the Abhidhamma Pitaka. It's found in the commentaries on the Abhidhamma. So, let's see here. I keep saying so. I'm noticing that. So could I talk a little bit about Buddhaghosa and how authentic his translations are? Well, the translation part I already discussed. Buddhaghosa, in a way, some people compare him to like the St. Paul of Theravada, although probably it would be more correct to say that a monk named Moggali Puddhatissa is like the St. Paul of Theravada. He's like created Theravada at the Third Council by presiding over the Third Council and introducing Abhidhamma texts and so forth. Buddhaghosa might be closer to like a Thomas Aquinas of Theravada Buddhism, something like that. But I think most Westerners would be better off not taking him very seriously. I mean, if you want to be like literate in Theravada Buddhism and know what the official doctrines and that sort of thing are, you have to be familiar with Buddhaghosa and the commentarial tradition. But if you just want to understand what the Buddha originally taught, then Buddhaghosa can do more harm than good. Because the commentaries are often just making wild guesses. And it's not necessarily the case that this commentarial literature really goes back to the time of the Buddha. Some of it might, but a lot of it is just apparently wild guesses from monks in Sri Lanka and southern India about stuff that happened hundreds of years previously in northern India. And a lot of it is guessing, and some of it is not very good guessing. So let's see here. Did I answer that question? Talk a little bit about Buddhaghosa. Well, I did talk a little bit about him and how authentic his translations are. Well, his translations you can't really say, because he's just translating some commentarial literature into Pali from, And it's a different style of Pali too. It's much more convoluted than like scriptural Pali. Let's see. I understand he has the biggest influence on the Theravada tradition. Yeah, he's one of the main names in Theravada, defining Theravada as like an orthodox system of doctrine. Yeah, he's one of the central people for that. But there are others, and even like you've got the Tipitaka, it's just the Buddhist scriptures, the Pali canon. Then you've got the Atagatas, or the commentaries, that most of the main ones were composed, or at least they're attributed to Buddhaghosa. And then you've got the Tikas, which are the sub-commentaries. And then after the Tikas, you've got the Anu Tikas, which are the sub-commentaries. So it's like the Tikas are commentaries on the commentaries, and the Anu Tikas are commentaries on the commentaries of the commentaries. And from the Buddhist point, or the Burmese Buddhist point of view, it's all authoritative. So, like the Mahasi method resorts to obscure claims made in an Anu Tika that was written like in early modern times, probably. The validity of the orthodoxy of the Mahasi method rests on some obscure statements made in an Anu Tika, like maybe in the 1600s. But Buddhaghosa, yeah, I really am not extremely impressed by Buddhaghosa. I'm not extremely impressed by Paul of Tarsus either, from like the Christian scriptural point of view. So, yeah, I think if you just want to be literate in what Theravada Buddhism is all about, including what is official orthodox doctrine, you have to be familiar with Buddhaghosa. But if you just want to follow the teachings of Buddha, then Buddhaghosa may cause more harm than good. You're better off just trusting your own intuition when you're reading the original texts without relying on commentarial interpretations of what those texts are saying, because sometimes they have to twist things around in order to make it fit this later orthodoxy that's superimposed on the texts. And that's one of the main reasons of the commentaries, is just try to interpret the entire Tipitaka along this later developed orthodox lines. And sometimes it takes stretching and twisting. And that's it. I'm done. I got other stuff to do today too. Like I got to finish digging the fish pond and move bags of cement and so forth. So I'm just going to call it good. If you got any questions, et cetera, you know the score on that one. If you think I can answer, feel free to ask in the questions in the comments below. And like and subscribe if you have not done so already. And be happy.